It's one of the world's most ancient and, frankly, most adaptable killers. Welcome to this explainer. Today we're going to take some pretty dense clinical guidelines and strict military medical protocols and translate them into a high-stakes briefing on how we actually manage malaria. Whether you're a medical student, a clinician, or honestly just someone fascinated by infectious diseases, we're going to give you an incredibly clear picture of how we fight this microscopic adversary right on the front lines of global health. So let's get right into it. Okay, let's start by just acknowledging the sheer scale of this threat. According to the Oxford Handbook of Clinical Medicine, over 3 billion people worldwide are currently at risk of contracting this disease. I mean, 3 billion! That's nearly half the human population, just living their daily lives in areas where a single mosquito bite can literally initiate a life-threatening medical emergency. It's a staggering number, and it absolutely demands our full attention. Section 1. The Global Adversary. To understand our medical countermeasures, we really need to understand the enemy we're facing on a global scale.
The Oxford Handbook paints this incredibly grim, often underreported reality. Someone dies of malaria every few seconds. Just let that sink in for a moment. Most of these victims, tragically, are children because their immune systems are completely naive to the parasite. And you know that old adage, the one that says adults living in endemic areas have full protective immunity? Well, that is dangerously untrue. That immunity wanes really rapidly over time. What that means is even locals are at severe risk if they leave an endemic area and later return. No one is entirely safe here.
Moving on to Section 2, Inside the Human Body. Let's look at how this microscopic attack actually unfolds once the body's outer defenses are breached. So, this tactical invasion by the Plasmodium parasite usually kicks off in the dark hours, from dusk to dawn. That's when a female Anopheles mosquito injects sporozoites straight into the human host. From there, these parasites travel super fast, straight to the liver. They multiply in secret, totally flying under the immune system's early radar. And then, finally, they burst out, launching this devastating, synchronized attack right on the patient's red blood cells. This causes massive hemolysis, which is the literal bursting of the red blood cells, and that triggers intense systemic inflammatory responses throughout the entire body. It's a massive shock to the system. But here is what's truly insidious: the concept of hypnozoites. When we're dealing with specific species like Plasmodium vivax or Plasmodium ovale, it's not just about the immediate, acute infection. These specific species actually create sleeper cells. We call them hypnozoites, and they hide entirely dormant in the liver. Because of this biological trick, a traveler or a deployed soldier could suffer a severe, completely unexpected clinical relapse weeks, months, or even years after leaving an endemic area, long after they thought they were totally in the clear. All right, Section 3, Clinical Signs and Symptoms. How does all this microscopic chaos actually look in a patient? Well, we have to strictly differentiate between typical and severe symptoms. Typical malaria presents in these intense, cyclical phases. First, severe shivering, where the patient feels freezing cold. Then, a burning hot stage, with temperatures frequently spiking over 40 degrees Celsius. And finally, just profound, exhausting sweating. But if that infection spirals out of control into severe malaria, those typical symptoms are rapidly replaced by catastrophic signs. We're talking respiratory distress, severe hypoglycemia, and clinical shock. These are massive red flags indicating rapid vital organ dysfunction and system failure. So, the absolutely crucial point for any clinician is rapid triage. The Oxford Handbook outlines these 5 grim signs specifically for fulminating falciparum malaria. If you observe any of these in your patient, especially altered consciousness, which points to cerebral malaria, or severe acidosis, where bicarbonate drops below 15 and the blood becomes dangerously acidic, that patient is in immediate, life-threatening danger. If it's unrecognized and untreated, mortality in these cases is incredibly high. There is no time to wait. Let's jump to Section 4, Prophylaxis and Prevention. Before a patient ever reaches that critical stage, how do we proactively shield populations and deployed personnel? To really grasp prophylaxis in high-stakes environments, we can look at the operational standards set by the United States Air Force. Their Aerospace Medicine Waiver Guide outlines incredibly strict protocols for aircrew and special duty personnel. Think about it. When your job involves pulling high G-forces in an advanced fighter jet, you simply cannot afford the debilitating chills and fever of malaria. And you definitely can't afford the brain fog or toxicity of a poorly chosen preventative drug, right? So this table breaks down the military's strict, context-dependent arsenal of prophylactic shields. Notice how the choice depends heavily on mission timing and local drug resistance. Chloroquine is an option, but only in sensitive areas, which, let's be honest, are getting pretty rare globally.
Atovacoin/proguano, which you might know as Malaron, is a daily pill that's highly tolerated by flight crews. And hey, remember those sleeper cells we talked about earlier? To target those dormant liver hypnozoites, medical officers deploy primaquine as a terminal prophylaxis. It's essentially a radical cure, given once personnel return from areas endemic for the vivax or ovale species.
But what's banned from this arsenal is just as important. The USAF strictly prohibits mefloquine, also known as Lariam, for all aircrew and special operators. Why? Because its potential neuropsychiatric side effects are severe. We're talking vivid hallucinations, severe anxiety, vertigo, dizziness. Obviously, that is completely incompatible with an aviation environment where split-second, clear-headed decision-making is literally a matter of life and death.
Section 5. Treating uncomplicated malaria. Okay, but what happens when the prophylactic shield fails? Or maybe it just wasn't used, and a patient presents with an active, uncomplicated infection?
Well, because multi-drug resistance has essentially rendered older drugs like chloroquine useless in a lot of regions, the World Health Organization mandates ACT, artemisinin-based combination therapy, as our primary counterattack. By combining an ultra-fast-acting artemisinin derivative with a longer-lasting partner drug, ACTs clear the parasite from the blood incredibly fast while also preventing resistant strains from surviving. So if you're dealing with uncomplicated falciparum malaria today, ACT is absolutely your gold standard weapon.
Which brings us to Section 6, Managing Severe Falciparum Malaria. This is really the climax of our clinical journey.
When faced with severe disease, every minute counts. For decades, intravenous quinine was the standard, but modern medicine has a much better weapon now. As the Oxford Handbook unequivocally states, intravenous parenteral artesunate is now the ultimate medical sword against this parasite. It's delivered right into the bloodstream for immediate effect, totally bypassing the digestive system. This is a massive medical victory, significantly outperforming older quinine regimens in preventing death in both adults and children. It's a real game changer.
And this builds into a very strict life-saving protocol. We aren't just handing out a drug, we're managing a feeling biological system. Step 1, immediate admission to the intensive care unit. Step 2, urgent administration of IV artesunate to rapidly knock down that parasite load. Then, and only then, once the patient is physiologically stabilized and can safely swallow, do we transition them back to a full course of oral ACT. We have to make sure we completely and permanently eradicate the infection.
During this ICU phase, aggressive monitoring is just as critical as the drugs themselves. You have to monitor fluid balance meticulously because pulmonary edema is a massive, sudden risk here. You must track glucose, prepare to hemofilter early if renal failure sets in, and use repeated, highly skilled microscopy to make sure the parasite count is actively dropping. You're aiming for at least a 75% decrease by 48 hours to confirm that the treatment is actually working.
And that brings us to a really profound realization. We have these incredibly precise guidelines, powerful actives, and strict operational protocols from organizations like the USAF and the WHO. But despite all of this, are we destined to just forever chase a microscopic enemy that's constantly learning to evade our strongest weapons? The parasite evolves, drug resistance spreads, and the battle just continues. Something to think about, right? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep questioning the science, and we'll catch you next time.